The moment Fraser grabbed my wrist and wrenched it backward. The grocery bag I'd been holding dropped straight to the kitchen floor. A jar of tomato sauce cracked against the tile on impact, and for one strange, disconnected second, I watched the red spread across the grout lines and thought it was blood before my brain caught up with what I was actually seeing. The pain came about 3 seconds later, a deep, radiating throb that started at the wrist joint and ran up to my elbow. Fraser was standing 2 feet from me, chest heaving, jaw set in that way it had developed over the past year or so, the way that used to mean he was stressed about a project deadline and now meant something else entirely. "Just wire it," he said. "It's not complicated. You type in the numbers and you send it." I didn't answer. I didn't cry. I set my purse down on the counter, carefully, the way you move when every instinct you have is suddenly very focused, and I walked to the front door of our house in Edmonton's West End, and I opened it and I left. I sat in my car in the driveway for maybe 30 seconds. My wrist was already beginning to swell. I pressed it gently with my other hand, put the car in reverse, and drove to my friend Darcy's apartment on the south side. 15 minutes, red lights and all, and by the time I parked in her lot, I had already decided what I was going to do. But to understand how we got there, how Fraser Malone, the man I married on a genuinely beautiful October afternoon in Banff, ended up twisting my wrist in our kitchen over a $25,000 condo down payment for his mother. I have to take you back about 4 years. I was 29 when I met Fraser at a housewarming party in Glenora. A mutual colleague had just bought a condo and wanted to fill it with people. Which is how you end up standing in a stranger's kitchen on a Friday evening, holding a glass of wine you didn't particularly want, talking to someone you didn't expect to matter. I was a pharmacist, 3 years into a position at a community pharmacy in the Westmount area, after finishing my degree at the U of A. I'd been on shift until 6, still had the faint antiseptic smell on my hands that I could never fully wash away before the end of the workday, and I was at that party entirely out of obligation. The colleague who'd invited me had covered 2 of my shifts in the past month, and I owed her an appearance. Fraser was in the living room talking to 2 people I didn't know. He was 32, broad-shouldered, working as a project coordinator for a commercial construction firm downtown. There was an easy, unhurried quality to the way he moved through a room, like someone who wasn't performing anything. He asked what I did and actually listened when I explained it, which sounds like a low bar and genuinely was not, in my experience at the time. We talked for close to 2 hours that night. He texted me the next afternoon. A proper Sunday message, not some late-night half-formed hey, asking if I wanted to get brunch the following weekend. I said yes before I'd finished reading it. We dated for just over a year before he proposed, nothing elaborate. A quiet evening at his apartment, pasta he'd made himself, a ring he'd picked out with help from his sister. Simple white gold band, small oval diamond, nothing over the top. He said he didn't want to do anything performative. He wanted to do this the real way, just the 2 of us and just the actual question. I liked that about him. We got married in Banff that October. 42 people, a small hotel event space with mountain views that earned every cliché ever written about them, a local caterer, and his college friend running a curated playlist because we couldn't justify a DJ for 42 guests. It was genuinely lovely. My mother cried happy tears. His father, who lived in Kelowna with his second wife, largely out of Fraser's orbit since childhood, gave a short, warm toast that landed well. We danced until almost midnight. I moved into Fraser's house in West Edmonton. We split the costs clearly. I covered the utilities and groceries. He handled the mortgage and property tax. We both put $600 a month each into a joint savings account, $1,200 combined, which we'd earmarked for a kitchen renovation. an eventual trip to Scotland, and whatever else life turned out to require. I kept my own TFSA, my own RRSP, my own credit card. I had lived alone for 4 years before Fraser. I understood what financial independence meant, and I wasn't casual about it. The first year and a half of marriage was good. I want to be clear about that before I say anything else, because this story is going to paint a picture that doesn't leave much room for what things actually were at the beginning. We built something that felt real. We cooked together on Sunday afternoons, drove out to Elk Island on long weekends, argued gently about small domestic failures. Who'd forgotten to call about the slow drain in the main bathroom, whether we were ordering takeout more than we should. We had a tabby cat named Clover who slept at the foot of the bed and treated Fraser with magnificent indifference. Life was good and relatively uncomplicated, and I was not naive about how rare that is. His mother, Irene Malone, lived about 45 minutes south of us in Leduc. She was 61, recently retired, after 28 years as an elementary school teacher with the Edmonton Catholic School Board. Fraser's father had left when Fraser was 12 and moved to Kelowna, and though they maintained a functional, if distant, relationship, Irene had been the consistent parental figure in Fraser's life for most of his formative years. She'd raised him largely on her own through his adolescence, and she loved him in the way that some parents do when a child becomes the central organizing principle of their emotional world. Completely, and without quite making room for the fact that he was now a grown married man with a partner and a home and a life she wasn't at the center of. She was never unkind to me directly. She was pleasant in that particular way that keeps you from ever having a specific grievance to name out loud. But there were small things. At our first Christmas together, she brought 2 dishes she knew Fraser loved and mentioned, twice, that she'd sheen them for him since he was 8 years old. When I offered her leftovers from what I'd contributed to the table, she smiled pleasantly and said she was fine. The smile was warm. The pause before she said it was not. At our first Easter together, she referred to me as Fraser's friend to her sister, on the phone, in the next room, perhaps not knowing I could hear. When I mentioned it to Fraser later, he said she hadn't meant anything by it. I believed him and moved on. I filed these things away somewhere in the back of my mind. There was always something more pressing to pay attention to. My pharmacy manager was leaving, and there was a transition happening. Fraser had a difficult project stretch. We were good, overall. We were building something. I told myself not to look too hard at every small thing. I should have kept the filing cabinet better organized, because it was about to fill up very quickly. The shift started around 18 months into our marriage, in a February that was cold even by Edmonton standards. Fraser came home from Sunday dinner at Irene's quieter than usual. Not upset, just elsewhere. I asked over dinner if everything was okay. He said yes. 2 days later, he brought something up at breakfast. My mom is having a harder time than she's been letting on, he said. Financially. I set down my coffee. What do you mean? Doesn't she have the teacher's pension? She does, but it's less than she expected. Some kind of adjustment they made to her benefit calculation before she retired. He looked at his oatmeal. I was thinking we could help her out a bit, monthly. He named a number, $200 a month. $200 is not a catastrophic amount. Irene was 61, living alone, and Fraser was her primary support system. I thought about it briefly, and I said, okay. We would revisit it in a few months. That was mistake number 1. Not because helping was wrong. That wasn't wrong at all. The mistake was that I said yes without asking a single question, without asking to see her actual expenses, without asking what specifically the pension adjustment had been, or what her monthly costs actually looked like. I said okay because Fraser seemed worried, and I loved him, and I wanted to make things easier for him. I filed the small, quiet internal objection away and moved forward. 200 became 350 within 3 months. Irene's car needed winter tires and a brake service. 350 became 500. A plumbing issue, a pipe in the basement, over $1,000 from a licensed plumber, reasonable enough on the face of it. Each increase arrived with a specific, plausible-sounding explanation, and I kept saying okay because each individual reason held up to basic scrutiny, and because I was slowly being maneuvered into a position where asking questions felt like choosing money over family. I understand now that this was not an accident. I didn't understand it at the time. By our second wedding anniversary, we were sending Irene $650 a month. Our joint savings account had stopped growing. It was sitting flat, the kitchen renovation and the Scotland trip indefinitely suspended. I mentioned this one evening in what I thought was a measured, reasonable way. I said I wanted us to look at our financial plan together, that I was concerned about our savings rate. Fraser went quiet in the way he had recently developed, jaw set, eyes slightly flat, a look that hadn't existed in the first year of our marriage. "She's my mother," he said. "What exactly is it you want me to do?" I said I wanted us to make a plan together. That was all. He told me I was making it into something it wasn't. I let it go. I filed it and let it go, and the cabinet in the back of my mind was getting heavy. Then came the condo. It was a Thursday evening in March, about 2.5 years into our marriage. Fraser walked in with a restless energy I recognized, the kind he had when he was about to deliver news he'd already decided on. He kissed me on the cheek and said, "My mom's building got sold." I turned from the stove. Sold to who? A developer. They're converting the units to ownership. Her landlord sent notice. She has 4 months to find somewhere else. He pulled up something on his phone. There's a 1-bedroom condo in her neighborhood, good building, reasonable HOA. She wants to buy instead of renting again. She's exhausted by the uncertainty. I waited. "The down payment is $25,000, he said. I told her we'd help cover it. Everything in the room went quiet. "You told her we'd cover $25,000, I said. Not a question, just repeating it aloud to hear it. It's a one-time thing. She'd own her place after this. No more landlords giving her notice, no more instability. We've got nearly $18,000 in the joint account right now, and I can pick up some overtime on the next project." Fraser. I set the wooden spoon down. We have just under $18,000 in that account. 2.5 years of contributions, minus everything we have been redirecting to your mother. We were saving for a renovation and a trip we've been talking about since before we got married. You want to hand over more than we actually have. Money we don't fully have, on a down payment for a condo for your mother, without once asking me. I'm asking you now. You already told her yes. He didn't answer that because it was true. I said no. Calmly, clearly, with every reason organized and laid out. We couldn't cover $25,000 without gutting what remained of our joint savings and pulling from our personal accounts. He hadn't consulted me before making a commitment in both our names. If Irene wanted to buy a condo, we could contribute something reasonable, a few thousand as a gift, and she could cover the remainder from her pension and whatever she'd put aside. Affordable housing programs existed in Alberta. There were options beyond emptying our savings for something that had never once been discussed between us. Fraser's response was to shut down completely. He didn't raise his voice that night. He simply stopped engaging, moved through the house in that flat, functional way that had become a kind of threat in itself, and spent the evening behind the closed bedroom door with his phone. The pressure lasted 3 weeks. He brought it up 6 times. Each attempt came with a different angle. Her health wouldn't improve as she got older, and she needed stability now. The condo would appreciate, so it was really an investment. He'd watched her sacrifice for years, and he owed her this. Did I understand how hard it had been for her? Each time I said no. Each time the house got a little colder. Then came the Saturday in early April when I came home from a morning shift to find him on his phone in the kitchen, speaking quietly and turning away when I walked in. He finished the call and came to stand across the island from me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Closed and resolved and slightly unfamiliar. "I need you to transfer the money today," he said. "She has to give the seller an answer by Monday." "Fraser, my answer hasn't changed." "It needs to." "It doesn't." What happened next took about 4 seconds. He reached across the island and grabbed my wrist and pulled. Not to stop me from leaving. I hadn't moved. Just grabbed it and pulled, hard enough that I had to catch myself on the counter with my other hand, and the jar of pasta sauce I'd set out earlier went off the edge and hit the floor. I got my arm back. I stepped away from the counter. He said my name. Then he said, "Wire the money." Then he said it again. "No," I said. I picked up my purse and I walked out. Darcy opened her apartment door and looked at my wrist before I said a word. The swelling had already started on the drive over. She brought me ice and sat with me at her kitchen table, and I told her everything. Not just that afternoon, all of it. The 200 that became 350, became 500, became 650. The closed-door bedroom calls that had started around 18 months in. The condo. 3 years of entries from that filing cabinet in the back of my mind, laid out flat and in order. When I finished, she was quiet. "You know what you need to do," she said. "I know," I said. I made 3 calls from her couch that evening. The first was to my mother in Calgary, who cried briefly and then shifted immediately into logistics, which was precisely what I needed. The second was to a family law lawyer named Carmen, whose name I had from my colleague Ria, who'd navigated her own separation 2 years earlier. Carmen picked up, heard my 30-second summary, and asked me to come in the next morning at 9. The third was to Edmonton Police Service's non-emergency line, where I described the incident and was advised to come in and make a formal statement. I did that at 8 the following morning, with Darcy beside me. The officer who took my statement was thorough and unhurried. She photographed my wrist. The bruising had developed fully overnight, a dark, unmistakable band across the inner joint, and walked me through the account 3 times. Before I left, she confirmed the file number and told me I had options. I told her I was already working on them. From the station, I drove directly to Carmen's office on 104th Avenue. She was in her early 50s, with the particular steady calm that comes from having seen every variation of this situation many times over. She asked about the joint savings account, my TFSA, my RRSP, whether both names were on the mortgage. They were. The credit cards, the car. I answered every question. I'd been a pharmacist for 6 years. Giving a precise, accurate history under pressure was not new to me. "Send me copies of every joint financial statement you can access," she said. Then she paused. "You mentioned his mother's pension." "Teacher's pension," I said. 28 years with Edmonton Catholic. Carmen nodded slowly. "The Alberta Teachers' Retirement Fund, after 28 years of pensionable service, is not a small benefit. We're likely talking somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000 a month in net pension, before CPP and before OAS, which she'd collect at 65. She looked at me steadily. "So I'd be interested to understand why someone on that income has required increasing financial transfers from you and your husband for the past 14 months. I went home that afternoon while Fraser was at work. I went into our shared home office and I opened the filing cabinet where we kept joint documents, insurance, tax returns, property records. Near the back, under a folder of Fraser's old pay stubs, was an envelope from the ATRF. It was addressed to Irene, at our address, which meant at some point she had used our house as a mailing address without mentioning it to either of us. I opened it. It was a quarterly pension statement. I read the net monthly figure twice. $4,116 a month. Before government benefits. I sat at that desk for a long time. I photographed every page. I forwarded the photos to Carmen. I packed a bag, and I went back to Darcy's, and I did not go back to that house again. Fraser showed up 2 mornings later. I was at Darcy's kitchen table, laptop open, going through joint account statements and forwarding them to Carmen when the buzzer sounded. Darcy checked the intercom camera and turned to me. "It's Fraser," she said quietly, "and Irene is with him." I closed my laptop. I stood up and smoothed the front of my shirt, and I walked to the door and opened it myself. Fraser looked like he hadn't slept in 2 nights, unshaven, red-rimmed eyes, hair unwashed. He stepped forward and then stopped because he saw my wrist. The bruising was a deep, dark stripe across the inner joint, unmistakable in the morning light, and I made no effort to cover it. I watched something move through his face when he saw it. Not remorse, exactly. More like the expression of a person who has been running a story about themselves and has just encountered evidence that doesn't fit. Behind him, Irene was already opening her mouth, and then she saw my wrist, and she went silent. The 3 of us stood there for a full 2 seconds without anyone speaking. Harper. Fraser's voice was different from the one that had been ordering me to wire money 48 hours ago. Quieter, uncertain. A little like someone much younger than 35. "I just want to talk." "Okay," I said. "Here's what we're going to talk about." I held up my phone and turned the screen toward him. It was a photograph of the ATRF pension statement. Irene's name at the top, the monthly net figure clearly visible. $4,116 a month, I said. That is your mother's pension. In addition to which, she will begin collecting CPP and old age security in 4 years. We have been sending her $650 a month for over a year because she told you her pension wasn't enough to cover her basic expenses. I let that sit for exactly 1 breath. I found this in our filing cabinet 2 days ago. It had been sent to our address. I lowered the phone. I filed a police report yesterday morning. I have the file number and photographs of my wrist that are now part of that record. I have copies of every joint financial transaction going back 3 years, which my lawyer also has. And I have a documented account of this injury that will exist permanently. I looked at him steadily. So if you came here to ask me to transfer $25,000 for a condo down payment, the answer is still no. If you came here to ask me to come home and behave as though the last 48 hours didn't happen, the answer is also no. I'm meeting with my lawyer again Thursday morning. Irene made a sound, a quick, caught breath, like a word that didn't fully form. I looked at her directly. It was the first time in a long time that I looked at her without softening what I saw. Irene, I was never anything other than respectful to you. I said yes to things I should have questioned earlier because I wanted to make things easier for your son, and I thought that was what a good partner did. I understand now that I was being quietly managed out of my own marriage, one reasonable-sounding request at a time. I don't have anything angry to say to you. I'm just finished. She closed her mouth. Fraser looked at the pension statement on my phone screen one more time. Something happened in his face that I'd never seen before. Not collapse, not remorse, but the expression of a person whose version of events has finally run completely out of road. He took one step back. Irene put her hand on his arm, and then, without another word between any of us, they turned and walked back to the elevator. I stood in the doorway and watched it close. The separation took 5 months to finalize. Carmen was methodical and thorough, and never spent a minute more on a call than she needed to. Because both our names were on the mortgage, I was entitled to equity, and after legal costs and the outstanding balance on the property, my share came to just under $29,000. My TFSA was untouched. I had kept it in my name alone from the beginning, which had once just been habit and now felt like foresight. My RRSP was entirely mine. The criminal file remained open. Fraser's lawyer reached out to Carmen, twice asking me to withdraw my statement. Twice I declined. The Crown eventually chose not to proceed. First incident, no prior record, injury classified as non-severe. But the record exists. It will always exist. I found a 2-bedroom apartment in the Ritchie neighborhood, close to the river valley. Second floor, south-facing windows in the living room that catch good light in the afternoon. I moved in on a Saturday in late September with my mother, Darcy, and 2 co-workers from the pharmacy carrying boxes up the stairs while I directed from the landing. I took Clover. Fraser didn't dispute this, which was either a small act of genuine decency or simply the first sensible decision he'd made in a long time. Either way, she sat in her carrier on the passenger seat of my car. The afternoon I left the West End for the last time, one paw hooked casually over the edge of the carrier door, completely unbothered by the fact that her entire world had just rearranged itself. My mother drove up from Calgary the weekend I moved in. We assembled furniture on the living room floor and ordered Thai from a place down the street, and she sat across from me in the half-built apartment and looked at me with that clear, uncomplicated directness she's always had and said, "You good?" "Yeah," I said, and I meant it without qualification. Darcy threw a small housewarming 3 weeks later. 8 people, a good cheese board, a bottle of Okanagan sparkling wine she'd been keeping for the right occasion. Rhea, whose recommendation had started the whole process moving, brought a small succulent in a terracotta pot. It lives on my kitchen windowsill now, and it is genuinely thriving, which seems about right. Irene did eventually buy that condo in Leduc, from what I understand. She bought it herself with the pension she'd been collecting for 2 years while her son handed over money she'd convinced him she needed. I hope the building is solid. I hope the neighbors are quiet. She paid for it herself, the way people do when they want something that was never anyone else's responsibility to provide. I'm 33 now. I work 4 shifts a week. I've been maximizing my pre-TF contributions every year since the separation and making regular RSP deposits again, and the numbers are moving in the right direction. There's a savings account that it's steadily, and without interruption, toward things I'm choosing for myself. There's a faint discoloration across my inner wrist that shows up in certain light. I used to pull my sleeves down over it without thinking. Now, when I notice it, I just think of the morning I stopped waiting to feel certain enough to act, and understood that I had already waited long enough. That morning in our kitchen in the West End, I lost a jar of pasta sauce and a marriage. I kept the cat, the savings, the clarity, and Clover's magnificent indifference to everything that doesn't directly concern her. That, honestly, is more than enough to build on.